Thanks very much for coming and attending again. Today's talk is being given by Jostein, who's a third-year Ph.D. student of Dr. Chang's in the Development Studies Department, and he'll be talking about understanding economic growth and development, but looking specifically at the case of the African continent. So we'll be looking at the neoclassical, the traditional growth theories, and then critiquing them and exploring a bit more about how we understand economic growth in Africa. I'm sorry that we're starting a little late, but Jostein's just going to talk for about 40 minutes and we'll still have time for questions at the end. So if you'll join me in welcoming Jostein, please.
All right, it's recording. Hi everyone, I'm Jostein. I'm a third year in the Center of Development Studies here at Cambridge. First of all, I'd like to thank CSEP for inviting me and for also organizing these lecture series. I think it's a great initiative. I think there are a lot of people who touch upon questions that are closely related to what for those of you who study economics, that are not necessarily within the neoclassical sphere of economics, but yet do very good analysis, important analysis of important economic questions. So today I'm going to talk about understanding economic growth and development, the case of Africa. Bear with me, Africa is a continent of 54 countries. I'll get to the point of why I'm sort of aggregating Africa and how it makes sense within this analysis. So, this is the structure of today's talk. First, I'm going to introduce neoclassical growth theory, how most students in undergraduate degrees in economics are introduced to the concept of development. Then I'm going to talk a bit about the shortcomings of this growth theory, where I'm going to introduce the sphere of production and the role of the manufacturing sector in economic development. And then I'll introduce Africa and also two diverging but insufficient narratives of underdevelopment in Africa. Then we'll get to the policies for remedying lack of manufacturing in Africa, industrial policy. Vasiliki talked a bit about this last lecture, so this lecture builds in large part on that lecture, but I'm not going to talk too much in depth about industrial policy as she talked about it. I'm going to talk more about specific changes in the global economy, the globalisation of production, and how that has implications for industrial policy in Africa. Right, so 3 takeaways from this lecture, right? If you want to write something, this might be what you want to write down. 1, structural transformation. That is the transformation of the production structure of the economy, a move away from the dependence of primary commodities towards especially manufacturing activities is the essence of economic development. 2, almost all African countries have in common that they have a negligible manufacturing base. Industrial policies must therefore be put on the forefront of the development agenda in African countries. 3, the expansion of global value chains calls for a reformulation of industrial policy in Africa, but still a lot of old style industrial policies are still relevant. What I mean by that, I'm going to get to later. All right, so why have some countries experienced rapid growth in incomes over the past century while others stay mired in poverty? Now this is the first sentence of chapter 1 in macroeconomics, European edition, which the Marshall librarian told me was the most commonly used macroeconomics textbook for undergrads here. So obviously this is a question that has been central to economics and still very, very much central to economics, the issue of development. I also looked through this book to sort of review how growth theory is presented today, about 60 pages, and what students are first introduced to most often is the solo growth model. Right, so this is basically neoclassical growth theory. The solo growth model says that in the long run, an economy's rate of savings determines its capital stock and thus its level of production. Higher production means more economic growth. Growth in savings and thus growth in the capital stock are endogenous to the model. Technological progress is also a factor, which is good, but it's exogenous. And most importantly, how this technological change, how technological progress happen, is not really analyzed much. More specifically, the importance of the production structure of a country is not really talked about, what I'm going to talk about now. Right. I think this quote from Jostein Løhr, who's the former chief economist of the World Bank, he captures the essence of economic development very well. I don't agree with Jostein Løhr on everything, but he was one of the people who reintroduced the importance of structural transformation to the World Bank agenda. In 2012, in his book, New Structural Economics, I believe, he said that all countries that remain poor have failed to achieve structural change. That is, they have been unable to diversify away from agriculture and the production of traditional goods into manufacturing and other modern activities. So if you look at history of manufacturing, there are actually very, very few countries that have managed to grow economically over a long time period without developing a manufacturing base. This is in capitalist development, starting with the UK and the Industrial Revolution. After the Second World War, we had particularly countries in East Asia, such as Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea. They were probably the fastest growth experiences we've seen, going from low income to high income. Later on, China. All these countries have grown thanks to increasing shares of manufacturing in their economic output. This is not saying that you can't grow without manufacturing, but these countries that have been able to do so have had very idiosyncratic elements. Very small economies most often, either dependent on oil or tradable services, like small state of Monaco, some in the Arab Peninsula, Liechtenstein, and so on. So if you have a sizable population, you will find it hard to develop without developing a manufacturing base. Now, why is this? Why is the relationship between manufacturing and economic development so strong? One is that manufacturing has higher productivity than other activities such as agriculture or services. It lends itself more easily to chemical processing and also is mechanized more easily. I recommend you all to read Nicholas Calder, who was a Cambridge economist. He's one of the people who laid the early theoretical foundations for why manufacturing is so important. And if you think about it, most technological advances we've seen, not only in manufacturing but also in other sectors, are a result of diffusion from the manufacturing sector. In agriculture, you'll find fertilizers, pesticides, agricultural machinery. In services, we have mechanized warehouses, transport equipment, right? Even organizational practices that originated in the manufacturing sector are now used in the services sector. Maybe some of you are familiar with Yo Sushi that delivers its food on a conveyor belt. And especially in developing countries, it makes a lot of sense to rely on manufacturing for economic development. It's a very, very strong driver for paid employment generation in poor countries, especially labor-intensive manufacturing, and also reduces the risk of macroeconomic shocks due to primary commodity price volatility. Now, what do I mean by this? A lot of poor countries' export baskets are very highly concentrated around a few primary commodities, that is, unprocessed agricultural goods or natural resources. Now, in the last decades, the prices of these commodities have fluctuated quite a lot. There is a lot of price volatility, right? So, for example, in recent months, Nigeria has had some problems with paying its civil servants because of the oil price fall. It's a country very dependent on its oil revenues. So diversifying towards more manufacturing reduces the macroeconomic shocks due to primary commodity dependence and price volatility of those commodities. All right, so now I'm going to introduce Africa. And I want to talk a bit about two very divergent stories of African development. This is, to the left, the front cover of The Economist magazine in the year 2000, where they labeled Africa the hopeless continent. 11 years later, in 2011, they had a feature on Africa Rising. There are a lot of people still sort of on both sides, although I think The Economist is the only one that sort of adheres to both, or I don't know if they still claim that Africa is hopeless. Let's hope not. But before I sort of go more in depth about manufacturing and industrial policy, I want to explain a bit how underdevelopment in Africa has been perceived and analyzed in economics, especially mainstream economics. Right, so the African growth strategy if we can term it that, is a set of explanations offered by the mainstream economics community to explain persistent underdevelopment in Africa. I'm writing mainstream now because I'm saying not necessarily neoclassical, although most economists who have offered these explanations have come from the neoclassical school of economics. So they've pointed out to, one, African countries are characterized by bad geography, right? They're landlocked, they don't have access to sea, therefore the export of goods is much more expensive. Also, African countries are located in a tropical climate, right? That's associated with tropical diseases such as malaria, such as the tsetse fly, such as soil that is not very conducive to productive agriculture. Jared Diamond writes about this in Guns, Germs, and Steel. Another common explanation is that in Africa you have low quality institutions, like you don't have parliamentary electoral systems, you don't have a proper rule of law, you have poor protection of property rights. Some of you might have read Asamuglu and Robinson's Why Nations Fail. They provide a very compelling explanation, which has been very influential recently, why countries remain poor because of their low quality institutions, and that institutions is a big causal factor in explaining economic development. Right, so what can we say about these arguments? First of all, history is ridden with counterfactuals, okay? There's lots of countries that have developed despite being landlocked. Austria, Switzerland. Even more telling is perhaps that the two fastest growing economies in Africa right now that are not dependent on natural resources are two countries that are landlocked, Rwanda and Ethiopia. The fastest growing economy in Africa right now for the past decade, Ethiopia actually started growing fast after it became landlocked, funnily enough. Right? Singapore, a country bang in the tropics. Italy, at some point had problems with malaria, but because of the development of productive capabilities, they managed to overcome this problem. Parts of Italy had problems with malaria. And what about institutions? Well, there are actually plenty of countries that don't fit into this matrix of good institutions, like China, South Korea, and Taiwan. These are perhaps the most successful growth experiences we've seen. China's growth is slowing down a bit now, but still 7% per capita GDP growth is very impressive. South Korea's bureaucracy was oiled with corruption in the 60s. China has also had problems with corruption. All these countries have had relatively authoritarian regimes. Robert Way, the political economist at LSE, terms the regimes of both South Korea and Taiwan during their periods of growth as authoritarian corporate regimes. A big reason why I think we can agree that geography is a factor. If you're landlocked, it does cost more, but it's not a sufficient explanation to explain economic development. And also rich countries on average have these sort of fit into the matrix of good institutions. But a lot of the results of these factors is what a guy called Morten Järven, I'll show you his book later, he calls it cookbook econometrics. In the 90s, it was very, very popular as more and more data was available on Africa to regress lots of variables on economic growth in Africa. So big cross-country regression analysis with growth on the left side as a dependent variable. And I think by the end of the 90s, there had been up to 122 variables suggested as explanations for underdevelopment in Africa. So there is correlation. There is some sort of correlation, right? But a lot of these explanations have had very weak theoretical foundations, which is very important if you want to explain the causal factors behind some sort of correlation, right? So this was lacking. Now I want to turn to the other narrative, which is more positive and has emerged as a result of growth picking up in Africa, or most African countries. I have to emphasize here that experiences vary. Some countries have been growing faster than others, but on aggregate, African countries have been growing much faster since about 2000, right? Now a lot of explanation has been offered as to why there is such a turnaround in economic growth. Most of these explanations you'll find in the media, such as in The Economist. Time magazine also had a feature on that. One is that African politics has become more open and more accountable. There has actually been quite an increase in democracies in Africa. There's been a huge drop in violent conflicts in Africa as well. Also, people argue that ICT devices has drawn more people into market activities and improved the quality of education. There's also been a marked progress in health indicators, especially infant mortality rates, malaria death rates, maternal mortality rates. And also there are apparently some positive demographic developments. Like you'll have a surge of people in Africa now entering the labor force. This means that you'll have a higher share of people in the labor force per dependent, right? And some people argue that Africa is starting to experience dividends of this. But there are also a number of things that this narrative misses out on, right? First of all is the growth experience. And this is a very important point. If you're interested in economic development and not growth in the power of an economy, you should look at growth of GDP per capita. These two rates might actually not differ that much. In China's case, for example, they don't. But in Africa, the difference is huge. It's grown at about, the continent has grown on average between 4 and 5% if you don't look at per capita growth. But if you look at per capita growth, it's about 2% from 2000 to 2014, which is approximately the period of Africa's rise, compared to about 8% in East Asia, another group of countries that have grown fast in this time period, led by China. That's 1/4 of the growth rate in East Asia. So the growth, first of all, is not that high. A lot of the growth has come from increased revenues and prices of natural resources. Over 60% of the GDP in Africa is comprised of countries that are highly dependent on natural resources, especially oil, like Nigeria, Sudan, Angola. And also, if you look more closely at poverty rates, they haven't actually improved that much, as well as vulnerable employment rates. There are still over 70% of people in Africa who lives below $2 a day, as measured through purchasing power parity. This is barely an improvement from 1980. Same with vulnerable employment. A lot of people in African countries are stuck in jobs which have no contractual arrangements, right? So I think the vulnerable employment rate is something at 75% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa. That's about the same as 1980 as well. In the same time period, other developing regions or other continents that have a high share of developing countries like Latin America and East Asia and the Pacific have reduced these rates. So as a consequence, actually during the period of Africa's rise, Africa has increased its share of world poverty. A big reason behind this is manufacturing. And this is why Africa, I think, is interesting to study in when you talk about the sphere of production and industrial policies, is that there has been a persistent lack of manufacturing industry in most African countries, exceptions being South Africa and Mauritius. Here's a statistic: roughly 95% of sub-Saharan Africa's population live in countries that had less than $100 manufacturing value added per capita in 2010, compared to 820 in China and 5,222 in the United States. There was some attempts in the 50s and 60s of industrial policy in Africa. This didn't succeed as well as, for example, in South Korea, but there was positive growth. Proper incentive designs, or the explanation is usually that proper incentive designs weren't formulated. The industries, or the industries, the firms in the manufacturing industries failed to become internationally competitive. So when the international oil crisis hit in 1973, a lot of them got indebted. They sought help from World Bank and the IMF. And at that time, the common policy for these lenders was to dismantle all government intervention in the economy, which is what happened. And in the 80s and the 90s, the result was that GDP in Africa was actually negative. GDP growth, sorry, GDP was not negative. That's not possible. All right, so on to the solution to this. Okay. So the solution must obviously be then, okay, we'd like to develop manufacturing industry. It's a big factor, a big cause of economic development. And those sort of policies are usually termed industrial policy. This is defined as a policy that deliberately favors particular industries over others to enhance efficiency and promote productivity growth for the whole of the economy as well as for targeted industries. So it specifically puts the role of the state, the role of government at the center. And that's why it's been quite contentious, right? It was first introduced by Alexander Hamilton, who some of you might have heard of. He was the first US Treasury Secretary, then theorized by Friedrich List. They had the opinion that the development of productive capabilities, as Friedrich List said, or more specifically manufacturing, is a big part of the prosperity, he said, of a country's economy, of the national economy. And to do this, opening up to international markets when industries are in their infancy will not work. You have to protect and nurture them. So through his theories, a term developed called the infant industry argument, which is basically about protecting manufacturing industries through various tools when it becomes competitive. Now this is, Vasiliki talked about this last time, it is a counter argument to David Ricardo's concept of comparative advantage, which postulates that countries would benefit from free international trade, with each country specializing in commodities, in the goods, with the least relative cost of production. Some of you might have studied the theory of comparative advantage, variations of this, the Heckscher-Ohlin-Samuelson theory, in your international trade courses in economics. I don't think that theories of industrial policy are that prominent. So this is also an attempt to sort of bring in more an alternative view of policies that can be used for economic development. Right, so how do you do industrial policy? Well, when a lot of people think about industrial policy, they usually think about tariffs and subsidies, trade policies, trade protection measures. But there are endless, I mean, the list of possible industrial policies are endless, right? Here I provided the example of the establishment of a development bank, like South Korea has done. South Korea had a national development bank that was very, very important in its period of rapid catch-up. Depreciating the currency through monetary policy to promote export is also an instrument that some governments use to promote the exports of certain industries. Other measures include infrastructure investments for certain industries, training of workers in certain firms, the setup of state-owned enterprises, right? But even if you implement all these tools, that does not guarantee the success of industrial policy. It's not a simple technical exercise, all right? A lot of countries have done these things but failed in doing so, okay? Usually the East Asian countries are provided as examples of success, and a lot of Latin American countries and also African countries, examples of not so much success. So in industrial policy, the politics has been quite emphasized, and an analysis of the relationship between the state and society, the political institutions, bureaucratic capabilities, and so on, is quite big in the industrial policy literature, right? I've tried to sum it up in one sentence here. You need good administrative capabilities and a state that has the potential to mobilize society around a common vision, and at the same time the autonomy to insulate itself against the narrow interests of individual actors. States that are characterized like this are usually termed developmental states. And again, the examples used are often South Korea and Taiwan, right? You might say, well, this is all fine, but what about states who actually don't have these sort of institutions characterized, or the governments that are not characterized by these institutions? Well, political institutions are not rigid. They are changeable. It's quite a common argument in Africa that African countries can't emulate the East Asian policies because they lack the same type of political institutions, right? I like to provide a counterexample. Ethiopia, which is a country I study, spent 3 months there doing field work, has grown at about 8% per capita per year, and this is a country perhaps in Africa with the most clear industrial policy plan, right? if you talk to bureaucrats and politicians in Ethiopia, they'll tell you behind our industrial policy is maybe first and foremost inspiration from successful industrial policies and conversations with people from these countries. They say we lie somewhere in between South Korea and China, right? And they also take quite a lot of inspirations from these tools. They have 5-year development plans that they started in 2005, just like China, South Korea, even the Soviet Union, Vietnam, and so on. The biggest export earner is a state-owned enterprise, Ethiopian Airlines, right? Infrastructure provision and investments, especially the investment in roads and electricity, has been a big part of the development agenda in Ethiopia. But Ethiopia is doing something else as well. They're attracting quite a few foreign investors to build up capacity in certain industries because lack of savings is quite prominent in poor countries. And this issue of foreign investors is what I'm going to talk about next, right? So I've talked about industrial policy so far, and now I want to talk about a specific global change or a change in the global economic system that requires a rethink or a reformulation of industrial policy, right? Which is the expansion of global value chains. What is global value chains? So global value chains is basically all the people, all the processes involved in producing a product. Now the expansion of global value chains, which has taken place since about the 1990s, driven by falling trade and investment barriers and also advances in information and communication technology, has led to these value chains becoming more global, right? So you have stages of production taking place in different countries. Like H&M might go to a Chinese textile manufacturer and say, okay, we'd like you to produce X amount of this product. We'll give you the design, we're gonna market it. You can produce it wherever you want. China might then go to Ethiopia and say, hey, you know, we're a Chinese manufacturer, we cater to the needs of Western retailers, can you produce this for us? And then the Ethiopians will produce. So there are so many relations now, much more than before, so many from when you actually buy the product until it's produced, it takes place all over the world, right? So in large part, it's been driven by transnational corporations, purchasing more of the raw materials and intermediate inputs from abroad. And a lot of companies in the West have relocated parts of their value chains to developing countries in search for cost savings and also cheap labor. This is called outsourcing. You also have Western companies going to countries in search for markets in those countries. That's a different type, which I'm not going to talk that much about, but a little bit. Right, so there are a lot of opportunities with this expansion of global value chains. In Africa, foreign direct investments have increased from about $3 billion to $57 billion from 1990, the sort of start of the global value chain expansion, to 2013. That's the largest increase in FDI in any continent in this time period. Right, so a lot of foreign investors are coming to Africa at a breakneck speed, right? And this foreign investment for a lot of countries, foreign investment can be an important tool to raise investment rates. It can also result in technological upgrading or technological spillovers, right? The technology and the organizational practices that foreign firms bring with them can result in economic development in the host country, right? Singapore did this very successfully. China has also attracted a lot of foreign investors and set up export processing zones. This has been a big part of China's industrialization strategy, right? The expansion of GVCs also means that production has become increasingly segmented, and in theory, this should make it easier for developing countries to specialize in the segment of a product or a chain, right? So instead of engaging in the complicated task of sort of specializing in the entire vertically integrated chain of a product, you just choose a niche, which is not necessarily that difficult. You can specialize in that, and that will be part of your industrialization strategy. There are quite a few challenges with global value chains as well. A lot of it has to do with increasing power of transnational corporations. What we've seen is that the expansion and consolidation of the world's most powerful transnational corporations, predominantly based in the West, have proliferated. So, for example, if we look at the increase in assets of foreign affiliates from 1990 to about 2013, most recent data, it's been from 4 trillion to $97 trillion, which I think is something like 130% of world GDP. Also, the power of certain transnational corporations has consolidated quite a lot. In almost every global industry, you'll find that 2 to 6 companies have over 50% of the market share, most often more, up to 80% of the market share, right? Here's a statistic. The Guardian calculated that Walmart ranked as China's 7th largest trading partner ahead of the United Kingdom. This is pretty amazing. Now, is there really a problem with this? You know, there is. The problem is that the expansion and the consolidation allows a small number of actors to appropriate increasing shares of profits over a larger markets. So when these transnational corporations go to developing countries, they don't bring with them their most innovative activities, the ones that bring about the largest profits, right? They usually locate those activities that have low entry barriers and don't really result in a lot of profits. Nor does it help that the developing country's share in manufacturing production has doubled since about 1980. The global pool of unskilled labor has tripled since 1990, which means that the amount of countries specializing now in labor-intensive, low-technology manufacturing production like footwear, textiles, garments, furniture, toys, so on, it's increasing. And actually, you're seeing a decreasing relative price of these type of manufacturing activities to the production services at the upper end of the chain, like design, branding, marketing, retail, so on. So, is really, you know, manufacturing and manufacturing specialization in a lower end segment, labor-intensive manufacturing, really a realistic route to economic development? Here's a quote from the UN Economic Commission for Africa's flagship report in 2015 called Trade for Industrialization or something like that. They focus on this issue of transnational corporation, and they say that transnational foreign-owned firms in the longer run are not far from taking full control of almost all profit-making opportunities at the expense of the weak African smallholder agriculture, totally crowding out along the way the emergence of indigenous-owned food giants or branded agribusiness. There's urgent need to see African governments intervene to prevent emerging success stories of the indigenous food sector be financially cannibalized and owned across Africa by the most financially endowed firms in the food and retail industry. So especially in Africa, food and retail are being targeted by transnational corporations. I think you'll actually have a hard time finding an industry that is internationally competitive in African countries that is not dominated by transnational corporations or corporations from abroad, from other countries. So what does this mean for industrial policy? One, I talked about already. It might not be as easy now as before to develop purely based on labor-intensive manufacturing, but it might still be an important strategy, part of a wider strategy of industrializing towards more high-tech activities, right? You'll basically get more money, you'll provide more jobs, and you'll provide more linkages to agriculture through labor-intensive manufacturing than just exporting raw materials and natural resources by themselves, okay? Producer services have also become more important. It's difficult, but not impossible for low-income countries to actually try and design and brand these products and sell them to high-end markets. In Ethiopia, there is a company called Soul Rebels, a footwear producer that actually does this and is quite successful in this on a large scale. We also have to remember that global value chains are not an entirely new phenomenon. They existed, they existed for a long time. In the 50s, Taiwan did massive assembly operations on Japanese electrical consumer goods. In the 70s, Nike outsourced about 80% of its shoe production to Taiwan and South Korea. So people who say that, well, you can't really look at Taiwan or South Korea or what they did in their periods of catch-up because these things didn't exist then, they're wrong. But they have definitely proliferated, right? Some people also say that segment specialization and having a liberal trading regime towards imported inputs is more important now than before. This has been important in some countries, as I said, manufacturing assembly in a lot of East Asian countries, which is basically segment specialization, right? But it's very important that this doesn't prevent the creation of linkages to the domestic economy. So for example, in the Dominican Republic, there was a firm in the 1990s that specialized in sewing jeans. The jeans, the design, and the jeans themselves came from the US. They said, please sew our jeans, right? And also the inputs needed for this, the jeans, came from the US, right? So they did a small thing in the Dominican Republic. They basically just sewed the jeans. Now, when labor costs in the Dominican Republic increased, then the firm easily just moved their entire activity to another country with cheaper labor. This has become quite a common practice, actually, in countries that specialize in low-end niche production. Transnational corporations have become very, very mobile, and they easily jump from one country to the next once labor costs increase. If you create linkages, which basically means if you're a footwear producer and you also use leather in your country, it gives more of an incentive for the country to stay, or for the company to stay in your country, because they have cheap access and easy access to leather. As well, if you produce cotton, Ethiopia, that I've mentioned a few times, is a country that tries to specialize heavily in these two industries in the next 5 years, footwear production and apparel production. And they're very, very careful to try and create linkages to its livestock sector, leather production, which is the biggest in Africa, and also trying to produce cotton that meets international quality standards, right? And the last point that some people make, that now more than before, strategic bargaining with TECs is more important, and I completely agree with that. With the increase in foreign direct investment, I don't think it's going to stop at some point. The low-income countries' development strategies will be more centered around inviting foreign companies. If you do this in a smart way, if you manage to raise your investment rates, right? Basically targeting TNCs who provide some investment and don't just extract natural resources, and also make sure technological spillovers happen, this can be an avenue for economic development. I think I should stop there. We've gone through some topics. Thank you for listening. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Paper Zero. And essay question. I know some of you might write an essay, so I prepared a little question with reference to a specific industry with market presence in Africa. Discuss if and how the globalization of production has altered African countries' opportunity to climb up the value chain. And then some readings. Various ones. I brought 2 books here that I can just quickly hold up. One is Hauge Chang's Economics, the User's Guide. He has a chapter there that talks about production, right? How does your garden grow, or something like that. It's chapter 7. Another is an upcoming report by Hauge, myself, and another colleague of mine. We've written a report for the UN Economic Commission for Africa called Smart Industrial Policies for Africa in the 21st Century. It's going to be published in about a month. If you're interested, just get in touch with me and I'll send it to you when it's published. A few other readings, Milberg and Winkler on a great book on global value chains. A politician in Ethiopia has written a book published by Oxford University Press on industrial policy in Ethiopia. And this guy has written about sort of the shortcomings of mainstream economics, mainstream economists' take on African underdevelopment in the 90s. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Jostein. I think that was a really good sort of coverage of how economists understand African economic development sort of over the last 20 years and bring it up to like real contemporary times with global value chains. And I think the fact that Jostein is actually on the reading list tells you that we can be speaking to someone much better in terms of understanding these phenomena. I'll open it up for questions now. Can we get a few? There's one of the. We'll just take it one-on-one.
Thanks for the talk. You mentioned that the way forward for Africa is to specialize in niche industries. But at the same time, how would that be compatible with a goal of moving up to global value chain?
Okay, should I repeat the question?
So, how is an industrial policy of specializing in niche industries compatible with moving up the global value chain?
Yeah. So, good question. So, a person in the audience asked if, or said that I said that African countries should consider specializing in niche industries, and how is that compatible with moving up the value chain? So, as I mentioned, some countries have used niche specialization as a strategy, like assembly manufacturing, for example, right? As a part of a wider industrialization strategy. This is definitely not enough, though. A lot of countries have been stuck in niches and haven't really been able to develop economically because of niche specialization. Mexico is a good example that did a lot of manufacturing assembly after liberalization in the 1990s, but failed to create linkages of the wider economy. But what it can do, I mean, niche specialization can give you, can develop certain manufacturing capabilities. Some capabilities that you develop in a certain manufacturing industry can spill over to others. Some cannot, right? For example, again, I'm going to refer to my experience in Ethiopia. When I interviewed firm managers there, they talk about the initial difficulty of instilling factory discipline because Ethiopia has traditionally been an agricultural society, right? So most people that work in agriculture, not used to working in factories, they have, Chinese companies there have a scheme of sending Ethiopian workers to China for 6 weeks, then they come back and so on. So although Ethiopia might not want to be a footwear producer, right? They can transfer some of that manufacturing capability to other activities as well. But it's a good point, and as I mentioned, there are a lot of dangers with just niche specialization. I think one of the most important things, especially for low-income countries, is to create what Albert Hirschman, a development economist from the last century, called backward linkages. It was big on linkages. So for example, if you produce something, a manufacturing good, right, creating backward linkages to the domestic economy is important. So as I mentioned, if you produce shoes, right, if you import all the inputs for the shoes and just sort of assemble them or put them together, that's niche specialization. But if you actually make the leather as well, that's not niche specialization. And then you'll create employment in the agricultural sector. And you don't have to spend money on imported inputs, right? So it's a fine balance, okay? But I would actually agree with you. I would say be more careful with, more hesitant to specializing in niches than not.
Well done. Yeah.
You mentioned the discourse regarding catch-up development in Africa and how we could be looking towards kind of Southeast Asian industrialization. I was just wondering what you thought about arguments from people like Atul Kohli and Ben Selwyn, who said that the neo-Listian approach often doesn't acknowledge the fact that the Southeast Asian experience often involved authoritarian regimes and like the repression of labor and like cohesive capitalists.
Didn't involve the repression of labor?
That it did.
It did involve the repression of labor. Okay. So this person obviously knows the literature very, very well, quoting Kohli and stuff. So a person from the audience basically asked if the neo-Listian, basically building on Friedrich List, right, has shortcomings, and especially that those people who say that African countries should build on Southeast Asian experiences is not feasible. Did I get that question right?
Yeah, just like, because there was this argument by Kohli that it didn't, that kind of approach didn't acknowledge the fact that there was big, like, what did he say, that the experience in Southeast Asia combined repression and profit, and a lot of the industrialization was helped along by authoritarian regimes.
So that's true. Especially Taiwan and South Korea were characterized during their periods of catch-up, and also Singapore by non-democratic regimes, I would say. Singapore even had wage freezes for about a decade during its period of catch-up. Ethiopia is also quite an authoritarian regime, And although they don't have wage freezes, the wages of workers in the labor-intensive manufacturing industries are not well paid. So I would say that it's not impossible to duplicate these experiences, but politically, is it feasible? Is it good that these people don't get high wages? I think there is a fine balance to strike, especially in early stages of development, because to build on low wages is important to become internationally competitive in these industries, which is, it's a fine line. We have to acknowledge labor rights, right? But as well, you want countries to become internationally competitive in these industries, and more they're characterized by lower and lower relative labor costs. I don't know if I answered that, but yeah.
Any more questions? Yeah, we get first.
Yes, so I wanted to ask about specialization in the industries that are not cutting-edge technology. So I mean, you mentioned already the importance of backward linkage, but I think that, I mean, in terms of some industries like footwear, you can think of it that now, as compared to 100 years ago, there are so many countries, so many industries around the world that have already gained profits, that there is not much profits to get from it if you go into that industry. So is that, in thinking about that, is it then good for a country to go into it seeking for profits, or is it good to just get to the edge of the technological development?
So if it's good to go into these sort of low-tech industries just for the sake of profit, or for
basically getting higher to the higher technological tier of development?
Okay, I would say both, right? So as you say, and as I mentioned, you won't reap as many dividends, as much profits from these industries as before, right? But once you do specialize in these industries, you're actually closer, once you get to know the international market, to also developing producer services in these industries, right? So I don't think necessarily sort of producing shoes, but also marketing shoes and designing shoes, although it's becoming segmented, I don't think it has to be, right? There are a lot of countries that try to develop full-fledged industries, the entire range of activities, which I do think makes sense. And I hope you will see more developing countries starting to market their products, sending brands, African brands, made and designed in Africa, to Western markets. I think Tony,
Sorry, but I only have time for this one.
Tony?
Do you think that industrialization in Africa is zero-sum, to the extent that, do you think it's possible for all African nations to industrialize, or is what's going to happen is a few might and then the others get left behind?
Yeah. All right. So I mean, you're basically saying it sounds pretty impossible for everyone to do the same thing, the fallacy of composition. Well, I mean, on one hand, when you have industrialization, you have raising incomes in a lot of countries. So they're going to be with increased, sort of, if we have increased industrialization in poor countries, there's going to be an increase in consumption as well. So you'll also have more markets to export to. But as you say, sort of, if I get you right, it's sort of a fallacy of composition proposition that you're raising, that everyone can't do the same thing, and that's right. A lot of economic development is about finding things that haven't been done, right? Innovation. And most countries, everyone are saying, we want to do the same thing. We want to make shoes, we want to make clothes, we want to make toys, because that's the easiest way. We have to go a bit for what's realistic now, or comparative advantage. So I don't think it's realistic. I mean, in an optimal world, you'll see lots of countries having different manufacturing activities, specializing in different things, and also having sort of similar technology intensity. But, you know, right now, and for a long time, in the age of capitalism, the world has been characterized in this sense, in the sense of production, by a center and a periphery that sort of, and the periphery does the same, either export raw materials, and it's now more and more a question of, can we also claim that this periphery is also production of labor-intensive manufacturing goods? So it can happen that all of them can industrialize, but as you say, it's difficult if everyone does the same thing. And this is, and a more and more popular argument that, as I mentioned, the developing country share in manufacturing has doubled since 1980.
Thank you. Okay, those are really good questions, so thank you. Before you go, I've just got 3 quick points. Firstly, if you're not on the mailing list and you want to be updated about when our lectures are, which are weekly of course, please come to the front and sign up afterwards. Secondly, there's a lecture going on tomorrow by our parent organisations, Cambridge Society for Economic Pluralism, which is on rethinking the relationship between economics and geopolitics, and that's going to be from 5:30 to 7 in room 3 of this building. And finally, our next lecture is by Ivan Reich. And he is one of the original founders of Paper Zero, and he's very passionate and it's very good at what he's talking about. He's talking on oligopoly and regional development in capitalism, and I strongly recommend him to you. But let's give Jostein one more round of applause.